This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin.
Put it into something like Prairie STRIPS. Since farmers are not investing money in inputs on low yielding acres, it does help their bottom line economically. So yeah, in the long run, not farming sub-profitable acres is, going to make farmer a little bit more money.
So welcome to Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. I'm your co-host Jerry Clark with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension in Chippewa County, serving as an agricultural agent. And today my co-host is Joe Zimbrick. Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. My name's Joe Zimbrick. I'm the crops and soils educator in Dodge and Fond du Lac counties in Wisconsin. And today we're going to shift gears a little bit away from our typical crops and talk about the STRIPS program, which is an ongoing research project at Iowa State University. And we have two guests joining us today, Omar DeCoke Mercado, the outreach specialist for the STRIPS program. And we also have Tim Youngquist, who is the farmer liaison for that project. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So, I went through the university system, and I've been hearing about STRIPS for the last probably 5 to 10 years, really. And I think it's a really interesting project. First, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background. Let's start there. If you would, just tell us your background, what you do, your involvement with the STRIPS program, and tell us maybe, how you arrived at the STRIPS program.
Tim, I'll let you take the charge on that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, I appreciate you guys inviting us up here because I think that it is a pretty interesting program. And even though we've been doing this for a little over 10 years now, it's still not incredibly well known. As you mentioned, so I'm Tim Youngquist. I'm what's called the farmer liaison with this project. Essentially, I serve as the pivot point between the researchers at Iowa State and then private farmers and landowners that are interested in getting prairie strips on their land. So I'll help with design issues, then implementation and maintenance down the road. And then I do a lot of outreach programs like this. So I've kind of got a little bit of expertise on farming and then on prairie establishment and prairie maintenance. I've been with the project since 2014, and that was kind of the shift from the original research project that took place at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge down by Prairie City, which is just east of Des Moines, which is the capital of Iowa. And that was where, back in 2007, the initial project started. So for about 6 or 7 years, a lot of research was taking place there. And as more and more outreach is taking place and more data was coming together from the team, people around the state of Iowa and beyond started to ask, well, if these results are so good on the wildlife refuge, could I maybe do this on my land? And that was kind of how it transitioned the project a little bit, where we moved off of the refuge and onto private property. So that's kind of where I came in.
So, I'm the project coordinator for STRIPS and communications lead. My kind of informal title is professional cat herder. I kind of coordinate our large team and make sure that our efforts are just fluid between departments, because we're a large transdisciplinary research group covering everything from agronomy, entomology, economics, human dimensions, microbiology. There's a large list of things that we're looking at. So I kind of help facilitate communications between researchers. Most recently, I led the team in writing the policy that's now live through the Conservation Reserve Program. So now farmers can sign up prairie strips under the Conservation Reserve Program and get a rental payment for that.
So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners probably aren't familiar with strips. So if you would, could you just tell us generally what are strips?
When it really comes down to it, exactly what it sounds like, just a strip of prairie in a row crop field. So the STRIPS acronym stands for Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. There's a couple words in there that aren't in the acronym, so it's a little mouthful.
Okay.
But yeah, it's just exactly what it sounds like. It's a strip of prairie at a minimum of 30 feet, max of 120 feet or more if you're not using CRP. But it's a strip of perennial native vegetation in row crop fields, strategically placed to intercept water.
So yeah, that was the question I had was, I was curious about, so the strips, minimum, maximum width, or is it mainly replacing grass waterways that we, contour strips that we typically see in agricultural fields? And then it sounds like they do, a requirement is for them to be native plantings or native species within those strips?
Yeah, Jerry, that's a lot of good questions there. So Omar's absolutely right. These are basically strips that are out in row crop fields, but don't get too hung up on the title of strips. These could be kind of blocks or larger chunks. You don't necessarily have to think of them as a ribbon that would go through the field.
Okay.
But if you consider, so down here in Iowa, we've got a lot of terraces that go across the hill slope or perpendicular to the flow of water, and that's how you'd be placing the prairie strips. They'd be basically serving as and kind of like you mentioned, the contour grass strips that you see up there in Wisconsin that I think a lot of people are maybe taking hay off of or something like that. That was how they'd be placed across the hill slope or along the edges of the field. And then, yeah, one of the differences is also that just the emphasis on the native vegetation. We don't have a required seed mix, but the using native grasses and forbs that would have made up the tall grass prairie, you get a lot of those wildlife benefits to the songbirds and the pollinators and the game birds and things like that.
So if there's if farmers are to put these on their in their farms, is there if it is cost shared, and maybe explain a little bit of that, if there's cost share dollars through some of the agencies, do they require hunting then, or can they use this property or these what is enrolled in these programs or these blocks? Can that be used for hunting then, or is it mainly for water, conserving water flow and those kind of things?
Yeah, Tim, I don't think there's any restrictions on hunting on CRP ground.
Yep, they could absolutely be used for hunting. Yeah, absolutely.
So the requirements for prairie strips and CRP, they follow under the guidelines of all other CRP practices. So the restrictions are similar. But the thing with prairie strips as a CRP practice is it's significantly more flexible than some of the existing practices that address the same thing, like riparian buffers or contour grass strips. Like, for example, the grass strips only require a minimum of 15 feet, but they don't require natives. They don't require a certain amount of flowering plants in every season. So the prairie strips practice is, taking the research that we've done and translated it into policy. So we're really trying to focus on the diversity component. So there's a minimum of 2 flowering plants in every throughout the growing season, so spring, summer, and fall, as an example of increased diversity. And I think Iowa so far is the only state that's requiring only natives. But since it's a national practice, we had to write it so it was flexible enough to appeal to seed markets out west, which they might not be able to access just strictly native seeds. But that's the major difference between existing practices and the prairie strips practices, the amount of diversity and the emphasis on native vegetation.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and kind of on that point, there's been a lot of research on sort of how wildlife, particularly pollinators and birds, respond to these strips in a watershed. And and it sounds like there's disproportional benefits. So could you maybe just elaborate a little bit about some of the research on wildlife and what you've all been seeing down there?
Yeah, that's been one of the neat things. We started at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, and that's actually the largest prairie reconstruction in North America. So it's a little bit, of course there was going to be some birds and things down there. But as we've moved off the refuge and we're on to more private farms, we've been seeing a lot of almost an even stronger effect, looking at some of the different pollinators and birds and things. I'm not an ornithologist, or I don't study the birds, but essentially we've been just finding a larger density of grassland birds. So things like red-winged blackbirds, dickcissels, common yellowthroats, meadowlarks, those are some of the main ones that are affected. And then also seeing larger numbers of game birds like pheasants and quail. And then, kind of on and on. I mean, finding more adult monarch butterflies, so some of those key pollinators, larger numbers of the ground beetles that are really good at seed predation for weed seeds, and then seeing a lot more of the native honeybees and things like that have been in kind of great decline over the last couple decades.
So some of the formal numbers that our team has looked at is that compared to row crop fields, prairie strips support a 3.5-fold increase in pollinator abundance, and then also a 2-fold increase in bird abundance, including birds of greatest conservation need. And that most recently, our pollinator team has been looking at honeybee production in prairie strips, and the research isn't published yet, but the results are suggesting that prairie strips can provide a late summer forage in August when there's a lack of floral resources in row crop fields. So after the senescence of soybean flowers, honeybees are looking like they're using prairie, not just prairie strips, but prairie in general as a floral and nectar resource, which is kind of an exciting thing that we're looking at right now.
So from a management standpoint, a farmer has fields that he'd like to, how does a farmer get involved or enrolled, or does he contact your shop at Iowa State, or how does this work to get individual farmers started in a program like this? Or how, and I guess another question would be how could it, translate to like Wisconsin, or, doing those kind of things, getting it off in a little larger area?
Yeah, you bet. We have, like, Tim is our farmer liaison, so that farmers can still contact our team and work with Tim and for designing and implementing prairie strips. But now that prairie strips is a CRP policy, every USDA service center in every county in every state nationwide has the technical assistance needed to be able to put this practice on the ground. So a farmer can just go to their county office and ask to put in prairie strips, and they'll be able to help that farmer out.
So then from so is it cost shared then? Is there cost sharing for seed or tillage or prepping the areas, those kind of things?
Yep, totally. So CRP is a minimum of 50% cost share. There's actually a really great article if listeners want to type in successful farming prairie strips cost share. There's an article that kind of highlights all of the details on how much cost share they could potentially get on prairie strips.
Great. One thing kind of on that note that I've been wondering if you all have tried to tackle with your research is, have you done any sort of like formal economic analysis? Like how are these impacting the bottom line for farmers? I mean, we all know that the commodity markets are, not great. So the thought of taking land out of production could be pretty tough for a lot of people to think about. What is your, research showing in terms of just whole farm economics?
We do have an economist on our team. His name is John Tyndall, and we have a publication on our website that you can access. If you go to prairiestrips.org and click on the How Do I Get Started, there's a really nice list of some extension publications there, and there's one called The Cost of Prairie Strips that highlights all the details on, different kinds of seed mixes and what that, level of diversity, higher diversities, higher seed mix, and, kind of looks at all that stuff. And what we're seeing is that if farmers implement prairie strips through CRP, the cost of implementation can be as low as $7 an acre. But again, there's a lot of different variables that go into calculating something like that. And right now our team is formalizing, whether or not taking land out of production is actually beneficial to the farmer's bottom line, because there's just so many different variables to consider there. But there are other researchers like Dave Muth and Steve Brewer and Tom Fenton and Bruno Basso's group that have looked at just sub-profitable acres, in the Midwest, and looked at what happens when we take those lands out of production and turn them into conservation practices. And what they're demonstrating is that when we do take those lands out of production, formal crop production, and put it into something like prairie strips, since farmers are not investing money in inputs on low yielding acres, it does help their bottom line economically. So yeah, in the long run, not farming sub-profitable acres is, going to make farmer a little bit more money. But we haven't formalized that finding as our own research group, but other researchers are demonstrating that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that maybe isn't completely intuitive until you sort of unpack it a little bit.
So are those those acres that are coming out of production or being identified, are those more the marginal soils, the marginal edges of fields, those kind of things? Is that where farmers are enrolling that land, or are they actually using it more as a traditional contour strip, or that kind of thing?
Yeah, my observation so far with the farmers that have enrolled, we have about over 250 farmers that have implemented prairie strips through CRP in the state since it launched in December. And what we've heard from them is that they're mostly using it as a field border, or maybe diversifying their terrace channel, or planting it along end rows, because with the practice in prairie strips, you can actually travel on the end rows, and that's a first for CRP, which farmers are finding really helpful. But yeah, in general, that placement is going to be in an area like a toe slope, or where a lot of water is moving, and those traditionally for row crop production are just going to be unproductive. And the nice thing about prairie is that it's been here for the last 10,000 years, and it's really well adapted to a wide array of different growing conditions. And the diversity of the prairie makes it really resilient in a lot of different types of climate. So if it's drought, or if it's really wet, or in between, there's plants that are going to do really well regardless of the scenario. So yeah, I would say that in general, farmers are putting it in areas of the field that are not as productive.
This question is more for Tim. So say I'm a farmer, I'm maybe a little bit interested in this. I've made a few steps. Now I'm planting my strips. I've contacted USDA. What do you generally see? I know prairie takes a long time to really develop. What do you see in terms of like the timeline for these things to really sort of develop, or what is can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. The prairie is very different agronomically than something like a corn or soybeans, or even an alfalfa or some of the hay crops. There's a DNR friend of mine down here that talks about the first 3 years of prairie, and they're the 3 P's. The first year you pray like hell. The third year you pray like hell. So but essentially, though, to break that down in a little more manageable, these prairie, a lot of them are very small seeded species. So they're going to put a lot of energy into these deep below ground roots during the first 2 years. A lot of the annual weeds that we have in the row crop fields are trying to put on as much growth as possible so they can make as much seed as possible so then they can reproduce. I mean, things like water hemp or pigweed, a lot of the lamb's quarters, those type of things. So by going in and mowing multiple times in that first year, essentially what we tell farmers is every time the height of the overall vegetation gets to about mid-calf or knee height, go out in that first year and mow it down to a height of about 4 to 6 inches. You want to just make sure that those small prairie plants are getting the sunlight, the water, and the nutrients that they need, and then that you're keeping all those annuals from going to seed and causing problems down the road. And then into that second year, you're going to want to mow at least one time. And again, up to a height of about 10 inches that second year. You can let it grow a little bit taller, but just getting in there with the mower for the first couple of years is going to be the best way to have success down the road, and then make sure that you're giving your prairie that competitive advantage it needs.
So are there other management things, Tim, once it's established? I'm assuming, after those first 2 years as native plants, there's no more inputs really needed at that point, correct?
Well, there's no more inputs, that's right. But, prairie being pitched as a no maintenance land cover is kind of a misnomer. If you'd go back, say 1,000 years, here in Iowa for certain, there was just a lot less tree cover or woody vegetation than there is now. And a lot of that, the whole state of Iowa, I think about 85% was covered with prairie, and that was burned very frequently. So most of the fire would have been coming from the Native Americans that were here who were burning for a variety of reasons, then lightning strikes and other natural fires. But these prairie plants have adapted with a regime of fire for thousands and thousands of years. So, going in sometime maybe after the spring of the third year, if you could get an application of a prescribed fire over that ground, you're really going to invigorate those native species. And then if you have, cottonwoods, willows, mulberries, dogwoods, some of those trees that kind of want to just invade the grassland areas, you can really hold those back with a little bit of fire. Other than that, going out and doing periodic spot spraying. The trees are going to be a big enemy, but then also some of the perennial weeds. So down here, Canada thistle, that's an issue, something that it's going to reproduce by seed, but it's also going to reproduce by underground rhizome or roots that are moving. So, doing a little bit of scouting and just making sure that you don't have issues like that. And if you do, on our conventional farms, we encourage just some application of a spot spray of herbicide to get after some of those areas. So that would kind of be part of it. But by having a diversity of plants, that mix of the cool and warm season grasses, the forbs, the legumes, the sedges, all that stuff, you can really fill as many niches in that bare ground as possible that will help you down the road, keep other species from invading into those strips.
Great. So I kind of have a follow-up question to that. So we're seeing up here more and more people are shifting to 2,4-D resistant soybeans and dicamba resistant soybeans, and I'm sure you have that in Iowa as well. Have you run into any issues where you have these broadleaf herbicides that are drifting onto strips and wiping out some of the broadleaves in the strips?
Yeah, that's another really good question. And one of the neat things about moving off of the wildlife refuge at Neil Smith is these are commercial farms, and we're not asking anyone to do anything different aside from planting the prairie. They're using the same seed treatments, they're using the same herbicides as they were prior to the prairie. What we have seen is that herbicide drift is less of a problem. If a spray boom goes directly over the strips, absolutely, you can wipe out some of those broadleaf species, but we have seen less trouble with drift. What you'll get is maybe a plant that is going to really brown up, or the leaves will curl, or maybe it won't bloom in that growing season. But with those deep roots, it's largely going to be able to come back the next year from the roots. So they're always going to be the most sensitive again during that first like 2 or 3 years of establishment. If you have a little bit of drift, you might have some trouble. And then from just a purely management perspective or a field operations, by having small, narrow strips through the field, you do have to be more cognizant about when you go out to spray. Or if you have, say, a local co-op or someone that's being hired to do the spraying, making very sure that they know where the boundaries of that strip are, and then just, following all the rules that you should follow under a normal herbicide application, watching your wind speed, watching your temperature, all those things. So the drift is less of an issue, but it is still a concern if you're going to be putting something in the middle of the field.
Mhm.
What we need really is somebody crazy enough to make Roundup Ready Prairie.
Right.
And I would kind of add to what Tim's saying is that a lot of the folks that are putting in prairie strips are conservation minded, so they're going to be pretty conservative with their chemical application and be mindful of making sure that they're following label recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any farmers working in conjunction with, say, honey producers or beekeepers, apple growers that need that? If there's those early season native flowers that might provide some bees for area apple growers, or is there any working with another industry like that as part of this project?
Yeah, we do have a pollinator researcher pollinator research lead. His name is Matt O'Neill, who's working directly with these type of questions and honeybee producers. And most recently now we're looking at integrating prairie strips into solar fields and coupling that with honeybee production and kind of looking at the logistics of a system that could produce energy, have value added commodities like honeybees, honey, and row crops, along with conservation like prairie strips. So yeah, we're looking at that, and we actually have a couple students that are graduating with their dissertation soon. So hope to have some more formal numbers on that sort of stuff soon.
Great. Yeah, Omar, you mentioned that a lot of the people who are adopting or getting into strips right now are kind of conservation minded. What is sort of the plan to sort of break into new audiences? I mean, I imagine eventually you'd like to see a good percentage of Iowa covered in strips. How are you approaching this idea of, reaching new people, maybe farmers that haven't tried many conservation practices before?
Yeah, I think the issue with conservation in general is that there's not really an economic incentive to do that, and there hasn't really been an economic incentive for prairie outside of CRP. So, what I'm really interested in, and other researchers in our group are interested in, is how can we develop potential markets for the tallgrass prairie, and what kind of questions should we be asking to generate revenue from the prairie after a CRP contract is expired. So right now is a really great time because farmers can implement prairie strips through CRP in a 10 or 15 year contract, but what are they going to do after 10 or 15 years? Are they going to re-enroll it, or are they going to rotate that strip on the land and regenerate soils elsewhere on their farm? Or what opportunity is there outside of cost share and rental payment? So one example would be baling up all that biomass and integrating it in with manure from like a confined animal feeding operation, and generating biogas from an anaerobic digester by mixing the prairie biomass in with manure, and piping, making farms hubs for energy production. Other things like we just talked about is the possibility of integrating honeybees. There's other opportunities by integrating prairie strips within transmission line corridors and coupling conservation with energy production again, and then diversifying the edges around prairie strips with agroforestry commodities and silvopasture. And we want to think about these sort of things with from a systems lens, and how can prairie strips, the way they are now, evolve into a different type of agricultural production. One of the things I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about is using prairie strips as corridors to access cover crops. So looking at the efficacy of, running polywire along the edge of a strip or virtual fencing, and using those strips as roads to access cover crops, doing rotational grazing within row crop fields with, mobile electrical fence, coupling that with, access to solar panels and that sort of thing. So I think, just getting the churning going with creativity and farmers and getting them excited about diversifying their landscape and, doing something a little different, making their systems more resilient by adding more crops, adding, greater diversity in the rotations, I think is really where we should be moving towards. And there are farmers that are getting really excited about that sort of stuff. And I think, farmers lead by example, and they talk a lot amongst each other. And, you get a prairie strip on one field and the neighbor sees how crazy that guy is. And then they talk about that crazy guy. And then they start adopting, that practice themselves. And I think, at this point, we're beyond the innovation phase for, early adopters. And now we're kind of moving towards, the early majority. So I'm excited to see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years with this practice.
So as part of the project and having this just starting, are you taking soil? You mentioned re-energizing the soil. Does the project look at the soil health parameters like bulk density, infiltration, these measurables from a soil health standpoint? And then is that going to be, something that farmers look at if they are going to rotate out of this in 15 years to move it to another piece of land?
So we're looking at that right now with the Marshall McDaniel, soil scientist in the agronomy department, and his PhD student Cole Dutter, and then we have Corinne Rutowski at Michigan State, along with Nick Haddad, and they're all looking at the effects of prairie strips on soil health, both underneath the strip and in the cropland adjacent. We're curious what are the spatial and the temporal effects of moving prairie along a landscape. So down the hill slope, or what kind of effect does that have on building soil carbon, influence on the soil microbial community. So those are long-term questions, and we as of this year are terminating some of our legacy research sites at Neil Smith and taking those samples right now and trying to answer some of those questions.
Kind of related to that, on that point, the soil carbon point, we've been talking about carbon markets for a long time, and it seems like it's an inevitable thing that's going to happen eventually. Have any of you that have been involved in strips also tried to market your potential carbon sequestration that's happening with the strips, or is that something that you're all thinking about?
We don't have a lot of that going on yet, or certainly nothing formally, but with the first round of the farmers and landowners that have adopted the prairie strips practice, as Omar mentioned, they're conservation minded. So several of them are trying to link up with some of these private companies that are working to develop those value chains for things like carbon credits and some carbon trading. I don't know a lot about that, but many of these things, there are these disproportionate benefits that are coming from the prairie strips, and then a lot of things that there could be, a lot of new revenue streams for farmers that just aren't quite there yet. But over, potentially the next decade or two, hopefully some of that stuff will be more fleshed out, and hopefully some of our farmers or researchers at Iowa State will have a lot to do with that.
I guess I kind of want to shift gears a little bit. I know that you all are looking at how prairie strips can affect manure application. In Wisconsin, we have a lot of manure that's going out on the landscape. Could you talk a little bit about how prairie strips are being looked at with manure application in some of the CAFOs in Iowa?
Well, I can't really speak to the details, right, of any of the research that we're doing right now, because all of our findings are preliminary. But just to kind of speak to it in general, is that we're interested in whether or not prairie strips can mitigate the transfer of antibiotic resistant genes So to kind of give a little bit of a context is, farmers or hog producers give their pigs antibiotics. The antibiotics get transferred into the manure, and then the manure gets transferred onto the land. So the question is whether or not that those antibiotic resistant genes, because I got to back up a little bit more. So, the idea would be that that manure that has the antibiotics in it, with that prolonged exposure in the soil, that there's microbial communities that become resistant to it. Similarly to humans that get infected by like MRSA or something like that, antibiotic resistant bacteria. We're curious whether or not those resistant genes can be transferred within soil microbial communities. So we're looking at whether or not prairie strips can mitigate that resistant gene transfer. So if we implement prairie strips in a strategic place, whether or not when that effluent passes through the prairie strip, if those resistant genes come out the other side or not.
It's really interesting research.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, really interesting research, and definitely we'll be looking forward to seeing what those results show. In terms of invasive species, Tim mentioned that you have potentially, thistles, but I'm wondering, a lot of the prairies around here that aren't managed, super close, we'll see a lot of reed canary grass and Canada goldenrod. Have you run into any problems where you just have invasive species come through and kind of overtake these strips?
Yeah, the invasive species are always going to be a problem with prairie reconstructions, especially in these areas that are small. But what we'd like to look at is the seed mix that's going out in the first place, and putting seeds that are appropriate with the correct soil types. So putting the right mix of wet species in the low areas and things like that, because generally, that your reed canary, we've got a lot of our waterways that have, the wet spots, that the brome has kind of disappeared, and reed canary has kind of worked its way into that. And I mean, that's pretty tough to completely deal with. So I can't say that we've solved that by any means, but again, by just having the appropriate species of prairie plants and then getting the right mix, that can be kind of the best way to get started. And then, most of our prairie strips are going into either corn or soybean fields where the weed pressure or the weed bank has been controlled for years, if not decades. So that's really helpful. Going into a conversion of like a cool season pasture or something like that, a different land use, that's where you can have a lot more trouble, and trying to encourage farmers to do as much site prep as possible. So even, preparing for a year by doing a spray out of kind of a burn down repeatedly over 12 months to get rid of as much of that weed bank as possible before you go in with the prairie. Because if you rush into an existing pasture or kind of a cool season grass situation, it might be okay for a year or two, but you will have problems down the road. So that's certainly a concern, but I don't have any great answers for it.
Yeah.
I will say, I guess agronomically, having a thick stand of a monoculture like reed canary grass is not great from a wildlife perspective, but can be pretty effective from a soil erosion or a water filtration side. So depending upon what your goals are, having a little bit of a lower diversity planting, or even having some of these invasive species like, you mentioned the goldenrod or thistles, things like that. I mean, you're still seeing some of the benefits you'd get from the natives, just not quite as much.
Yeah, it seems like that perennial component is key.
So Tim, on that seed selection or the species selection, are there consultants helping with that? Is it mainly through the project? Are field agents and extension helping with some of these consultations if a farmer's interested, or who's helping the farmer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So every USDA office is going to have a list of approved contractors that can do the seeding, that can sell the seed, all that. So if you can get hooked up with the right seed salesperson, you can really do well there. I think some of the folks at USDA do a really good job with that as well. But it kind of depends, the USDA, I mean, there's a lot of diversity in staff, and this Prairie STRIPS practice is kind of new. So that's a little bit up in the air yet. If you're willing to spend a little bit of time and educate yourself, the University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center, they have an incredible amount of resources, and they're one of our STRIPS partners that's been doing a lot of the work on seed mixes and looking at, kind of economy mixes and pollinator mixes and diversity mixes and seeing, what are these benefits you're going to get? How much is it going to cost? And then what can you expect, down the road with your prairie planting? So there's a little bit of help from USDA, and there's a little bit of help from different seed contractors. We're kind of lucky like that. I mean, even there are a lot of seed sellers here in Iowa and then into Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. So you've got to do a little bit of looking around, but there are resources available.
While we're giving a shout out to the Tallgrass Prairie Center, we should give a shout out to the Sand County Foundation, which is Wisconsin based. They're one of our STRIPS partners too that are helping farmers implement STRIPS, and they're really great at what they do. So if Wisconsinites or Wisconsians, I don't
whatever we are.
We're cheeseheads, yeah.
Cheese lovers can contact Sand County Foundation.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. We have a couple of strips in Dodge County where I am right now as a result of some of the good work from the Sand County Foundation. What are some of the major lessons learned that if you were to start again, maybe Tim, you could respond to this. What are some of these major lessons that you've learned that you would try to pass on to new farmers?
When we started the project, we were kind of basing the design for the Prairie STRIPS more off of this contour grass strip, which is a USDA NRCS standard. And the grass strips were a minimum of 15 feet wide. So we installed a few of the first strips at about that 15-foot width, because as you're moving across the field, every 5 feet wider that you make that strip, you really can chew through acreage in a big hurry. So the wider the strip gets, the more land you take out of production. But that said, I think the CRP standard now, the Prairie Strip standard of a 30-foot wide strip, is a much more appropriate standard. And I wouldn't put anything out in the field that's less than that, because you're always going to have, whether it's spray drift or tillage drift. I mean, the edges of waterways and Prairie Strips, they can always just kind of move a little bit, with how big the equipment is now. So giving yourself something a little bit wider, I think, is going to be the best way. Then I think as far as advice, it's great to get the word out, and kind of help educate people about prairie, but there's no substitute for going out and seeing these in person and then talking to either a farmer or a landowner or someone that's actually worked around them. I think that's more valuable than anything, because really it's not adding that much to a field, and then you get a lot of benefits for that, especially if you're putting something, say on the low edge of the field where the water is running out of the field, or these areas of concentrated water flow that are moving through the field. If you can filter those on the way out, you're not changing the field in any significant way. So I think if you're hesitant at all, if you think you want Prairie STRIPS but you're not sure, I'd say starting in some kind of an edge of field buffer, that'd be the way to go. And then keeping that buffer 30 feet or wider would be kind of two of the big things. I mean, there's certainly a lot to it, but those are some of the main ones.
Yeah. For the people that are, thinking about doing this on a contour, I imagine you have to have some technical expertise, working with a GPS unit. In terms of installation, is the USDA helping with that installation process, or are they just providing the funds? Do you contract through, small contractors that are helping install these? How does that process usually play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. Layout is key, especially if you're moving into the infield strips, and having a GPS unit with a high degree of accuracy is really helpful. So here in Iowa, several of the USDA offices do have RTK GPS, or real-time kinematic, essentially sub-inch GPS that they can help to flag the strips. And that's been really, really helpful. Otherwise, maybe sometimes some of the contractors will have that ability as well. But yeah, having some kind of a GPS with a high degree of accuracy is going to be the best way to get these things laid out. And then wherever possible, laying out the strips in a way that you're creating uniform farming lanes in between them, so you're not creating an excessive burden to the farm operator that's going to take, every farm operation is going to take more time. So trying to create as smooth the lines as you can, and working with the contour as much as possible. But if you have a less than 5% slope, which I know maybe there's not a lot of that up in Wisconsin, but you can be really flexible with how you lay out the strips, and you can you don't have to adhere to the contour as closely as if you get above that 5% threshold.
So in identifying these fields, you kind of mentioned the precision ag, the GPS type of thing. Is that also helping to identify those low production areas of fields where, that's where a farmer could take, a part of a field out of production that just isn't profitable, since we can overlay these yield maps and all that kind of stuff? Are there farmers looking at those, or are they still primarily sticking to the edges of the field at this point?
Yeah, definitely some of both. We're at a unique opportunity right now where I think precision ag technology is more a part of farming than it's ever been in the past. And I think it's becoming more commonplace to run these analyses. And I've heard, some of the precision ag folks, say, think about breaking your field into grid squares and treating each one of those grid squares as a franchise restaurant. Some of those are going to sell more and some are going to sell less. And if you can eliminate some of those more lower producing areas, you can get a larger return on investment, or more bushels per acre from your whole field. One of the issues with that is that oftentimes a low producing area may be a little bit of a knob, or it may be a low wet spot. It's not necessarily going to lay out in a way that's going to be extremely conducive to being farmed around. And with these prairie strips, like I mentioned, you have to mow them, so you can't strand them out in the middle of the field. You need to have some way to get out there to them. So that's why, having these low producing areas on the edge of the field are a little bit easier, because they're just simpler to get to from a maintenance perspective. So I don't quite know, how we're going to get after some of these. You get into parts of Iowa, like north central Iowa in particular, there'll be a 200 by 200 meter knob in the middle of the field that, the topsoil is completely gone. But putting something like prairie out there that needs to be maintained, there's going to be some challenges to that. So I don't quite know how we get around that, but there are a lot of companies that are looking at those issues. So I'm hopeful that, as an area of active research, that's going to be better over the next 5-10 years.
I really like that analogy of the franchise restaurants, a new way of looking at a field. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Kind of another technical question that has come up in conversations that I've had with farmers. People are curious about their tile lines. We're getting bigger rain events and probably more rain on average, and tile is becoming increasingly commonplace. How are these strips impacting tile, if at all?
That's one that we've actually done a decent amount of work on. And, certainly a lot of these questions that you're asking are the same questions that I get every time I go out and talk to a group. So, we've had time to kind of calibrate and do some research. We've worked with first kind of some, underground sewer type companies that have these lighted cameras that can get pushed under the tile lines. And we've done a lot of recordings. We've actually got some videos on our website at prairiestrips.org if you do some searching around, where we looked at a prairie that was about 8 or 10 years old. And then we looked at a corn soybean rotation, and then we looked at some continuous corn fields. And these were 4-inch tile that were about 3.5 or 4 inch deep. So, very, very standard black plastic perforated tile. and we found a relatively similar amount of roots in the continuous cornfields as we found under the prairie. We've continued to expand, and we've gone out and looked at multiple other fields and multiple other moisture conditions, soil conditions, things like that. And it kind of seems to be, there can be some root penetration under the prairie, but there is root penetration under the field. We've seen root penetration under cover crop, but we haven't seen anything that's really troubling. Probably the biggest thing, again, we mentioned those cottonwoods and those woody vegetation. If you get some of those, they can tend to want to seek that moisture out that's in the tile line. The small roots will go through the perforation in the tile and begin to kind of expand, and that's where you could have some soil infiltration and get into some trouble. But that is one I'd encourage your listeners to go to the prairiestrips.org and look at the video that we have, because it's pretty neat. You know, it's an area that you really don't ever think about being able to see. I'd say it's kind of the journey to the center of the earth type of an adventure. You get to be, you know, in this little tunnel and looking at stuff, you know, and there's earthworms and spiders and some other things down there. But probably, and I'm rambling a little bit here, but if I was to install any new tile on my farm, I would probably put some kind of a product like there's all kinds of sleeves that you can put over the tile that can prevent the penetration of roots, or you could just do a non-perforated tile under that section of prairie, something like that. I mean, just to be extra cautious, but we really haven't seen enough to tell me that these prairie strips are going to be clogging any tile lines.
Well, that's helpful. I know a lot of people, that's kind of their first thought is how it's going to affect their tile.
I just think it's a great project, and especially with that sustainable part with all the different aspects of pollinators and putting them in solar fields and these kind of things. What a great project. I just think it's great.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of exciting opportunities to think creatively outside of the box in ways that maybe we don't always do in ag. So really interesting work. And thanks again to Tim and Omar for joining us. Appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate you guys helping us spread the word. And yeah, thanks for the great work you guys are doing.
Brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.